Today is Monday, February the 4th, 2019. So the topic of the morning is Bill Gallagher. Bill Gallagher's a local guy I've known for quite a while here. And he's an old World War II veteran. He's 98 years old. He's still getting along pretty good. He's the only guy I know, or I can think of right now, that tells me, he says, I've never had a job. And so I always say, it's pretty good. I don't know anybody that never had a job. And he says, no, I've never worked for anyone. I said, well, how come? He grew up out in California, I think probably in the Central Valley, because he talks about he baled hay. That was his first job out there. In farming was baling hay, and so he worked on a farm. I'm guessing, and then after that, he was drafted into service during World War II. Well, the thing about World War II for him, he might be one of those that you say just got the golden ticket. He says it's golden ticket because he said all during World War II, for some reason or another, hay farmer from the Central Valley got assigned to the Navy. And his assignment on the Navy was on a ship, but it wasn't a real ship. It was a yacht. And he captained this wooden yacht up and down the east coast of the United States looking for submarines, he said. And I don't know, maybe true, I don't know. And he said at one time they thought that they did see a submarine. And, you know, back then U-boats were pretty popular everywhere. And they were sinking a lot of transports. And anyway, so he and a small crew took this yacht, and they would sail from like Newport, New York, New Jersey, clear down to the Caribbean, turn around and go back. So that he said he never fired a shot, and but he did what they told him to do, and he was happy to do it. The interesting thing about that was years later, probably back in the early 2000s, this would have been at least 60 years after he was out of the Navy, he had the opportunity to go, and I'm going to say Seattle because it was a West Coast port, and that ship was still in service, or at least it still belonged to the Navy, and he got to go and visit that ship again 60 years after he captained it during World War II. So anyway, old Bill had quite the career. He's married to Shirley, and Shirley, they call her Mimi, and they call Bill Pappy. Well, Mimi was what she did was so interesting is during World War II, she was in the USO. And not only in the USO, she was in the traveling USO. And so she and a famous band leader, which I don't remember right now, went through the Pacific entertaining the troops toward the end of World War II. And she played the accordion. And she actually is such an interesting woman because she wrote a book about her experiences during the war and had a few copies published, and I bought a copy. So I have a copy of that down in the basement. You guys can get it out and read it. The interesting thing about it was back there during the war, especially people that were in the Pacific Theater, they hated the Japanese. So she brought that back from her time over there. She always called them Japs, and she really hated them. But she had seen firsthand what they did to the soldiers over there in the Pacific. But the funniest thing is, one of her grandkids marries a Japanese. So, and the funny thing about that was he was dating this girl, and he might even have been married to her. And one day she's coming back from Japan. She gets to the United States, doesn't have the right paperwork. And they said, no, refused entry. And they put her on the airplane, sent her back. But eventually she got to the U.S. and she got married, and they had kids, and they're Americans, and everything's fine. But Shirley, she was a wonderful woman, still alive too, 97 years old, I think, also. And I saw her at Christmas at the bank holiday. So anyway, Bill, after the service, like so many guys, uh, somehow or another he ends up in Alamosa. And the way he ended up here was he worked. He didn't. I don't know. He said he never had a job, but he had a guy who was uh, stockholder, or maybe even the originator of one of the biggest insurance companies in the United States. I don't know which one it was, but anyway, this guy was the one who thought up the idea of weekly premiums. Now, before this, whenever you bought life insurance or any insurance like that, when you bought it, you paid for it. Paid for the whole year. Well, he was back east in New York, so that might have been New York Life, but I don't know. Anyway, he came up with the idea if you're going to sell insurance, people can't afford to pay the whole premium all at once. So he got his whole sales crew out there going door to door after the war, and there was prosperity. People were making money, and they collected the premiums weekly. So anyway, they had all this money, and you know the scam that New York or of that insurance is they have these huge amounts of money, and until someone dies, they don't have to pay any of it out. They have some expenses and all. It was not that much. So they have all this leftover reserves, so they have to do something with it. Well, one thing this guy was doing is he came through Colorado and he was buying land. So he was taking the insurance money and he was buying land. And he came on the train, of course, this is before aviation, and he stayed downtown at the old Walsh Hotel. And Bill Gallagher said this guy was so cheap that he would reuse ice. If he had ice one night, he'd put it in the freezer. The next day, use it again. He would save oatmeal. If he didn't eat all of his oatmeal for breakfast, guess what's for breakfast the next day, frozen oatmeal. So anyway, Bill got to know him while he was here, and then Bill was helping him buy these farms and ranches around here. Anyway, so however that developed. So when I got to know Bill was back in the early 80s. I came to Alamosa in 1979, and I'll do an episode on the John Deere store. But so when I got to know him, he was farming, and he was also building buildings. And he was a fascinating guy because back then, if you wanted a metal building, he would basically just take out a back of the napkin, figure it out, and say, all right, I'll get it for you. And if you ask him how much it was or what it's going to cost, he'd say, it's going to be less than anybody else will charge you. All right. So I bought buildings from him. And so I'm pretty sure what happened then is he called the building company, and they had engineers and designers and people there at the metal building company. And so they would engineer it and design it. Then they'd send it out here, and then he would put it up. And yes, it was cheaper than anybody else would do it. And as a matter of fact, when we were building our house in the early 80s out in Waverly, I wanted to have an enclosed swimming pool. And I'll try to do a thing on the house too when I have time. And so the swimming pool, I wanted to span it, of course. You can't have a support pole right in the middle of the pool. And my house builder says, I don't know what you're going to do. You tell me. And this is old man Cook. And I said, I'm not sure what to do. So I called Bill Gallagher. I said, Bill, come out here and look at that. So he comes out and he looks at it and he says, yeah, it's no problem. He says, all we need is some metal I-beams. I'll order them for you. And I said, I know not to ask you how much because I know what you're going to tell me. So sure enough, over the swimming pool, he put these metal I-beams on top of the wall like this, and the pool's underneath. So he ordered, I want to say 2 I-beams. And so you had the two walls on the end, two I-beams in the middle that spanned the swimming pool, built the roof on top, put insulation under it, skinned out the underneath. Worked perfect. No engineering, no studies, no, just, all right, here, put these up. So all I did basically was measure it and order these things. It's been great. So anyway, so Bill went on. He's built uh, hundreds of metal buildings around, and he buy and sell real estate. And so he'd always, whenever he could, he'd either build a building or sell a farm or something. He'd carry back the paper and finance it himself because he wanted the interest. So he charged a little extra interest, but uh, people would do it because they don't have to go to the bank, don't have to screw around with anything, just make the payments to him. And Mimi, Shirley, she was the one in charge of collecting the money, and she did a good job. They are super rich right now. And he got to working for a guy named John Smith. And I'll do a segment, maybe even today, on John Smith. But he built all kinds of farm buildings all over this valley for John Smith. And the same thing, John would just call him up and say, "Hey, I need a building to cover up my cooler." Because what he would do is he'd cool lettuce and he'd cool spinach and some other things. And John was a really interesting guy. He's an attorney. And so Bill would go build it for him, and whatever it was, it was. And John would pay him or pay him payments or depend on his cash flow because John always had a creative cash flow situation. So anyway, the funny thing about Bill is he had a stub finger like this and on his right hand, and everybody always would ask him, "What happened to your finger?" And he says he'd always make up some wild ass story, and it's like, "None of your business," or "I lost it in a war," or something, like that. But one day for some reason, he told me, he says, really, he says, what happened was his brother and he were playing with a lawnmower. And it was one of those old lawnmowers with the sickle reels that you pushed. And as you pushed, the reel would cut the grass on a knife. And so Jim, his brother, gets to running with this thing and gets the the reel going like crazy and picks it up, and Bill sticks his finger in there and cut it right off. And so I I don't know when that was, if it was before the war or after the war. I should ask him that if I get a chance when that happened. But that's what happened to his finger. So anyway, he and his brother Jim, they owned an airplane together, and Bill was a pretty good VFR pilot, and they had a Comanche, and I think it's a 1969 Comanche, and Bill flew it for a long time, and then his son Tim is still flying it. He ended up with it, and so when Jim, who lived out in California, quit flying because he was a little older and not in such good health, then Bill bought his half out, and then or Tim bought his half or something like that. But anyway, the first airplane I bought, Bill went with me, and we went over just south of La Junta to a little airstrip over there run by some bandito, and he had this Cherokee 235 for sale. And Bill looks it all over, and I look it all over, and Bill says, "It's fine. Buy this one. It'll be okay." I said, "All right." So we jump in the thing, and I'd been taking lessons. I had my license, and he had his, and so we jump in that stupid Cherokee and come home. I don't think either one of us was checked out at it. Probably legal. I don't know, single engine land. But anyway, we brought that old Cherokee back in 235 Charger, white, blue stripes. And I flew that thing for several years. It was a terrific little airplane. We'd fly down to Arizona and see Grandma and Grandpa. By this time, they had moved to Sun City. So we'd go down there and see them, fly out to Kansas, see my dad and mom. And I actually flew dad back in that airplane once. I can remember doing that. And problem is, dad, I'll try to have a section on him too. He was a smoker, so he never get lung capacity. And when we came over the pass at about 12,000 feet, he was looking a little out of breath, but he was fine. You know, he wasn't all that old then. I'd have to do some calculating to see. So anyway, Bill and Shirley have been great friends over the years. If I think of some other stuff, I'll try to do an episode on it. They live over north of town. He built his own house over here. It's the same thing. He's put a metal roof on it, put heat in the floor. Whatever, it'll be fine. And so he always told me, I says, well, how much profit do you try to make? Because he'd buy these farms and sell these farms. And he was in league with a bunch of realtors here, got a little bit of shady reputation. And he says, I always try to make the Jewish 1%. I said, well, 1% ain't very much. He says, no, the Jewish 1%, Fred, is double your money. It's 100%. Oh, I said, all right, that's great. I see. Well, and the other thing he and Shirley like to do is they had a fifth wheel camper, and they would go every winter down to Puerto Penasca, which is Rocky Point in American. In Mexican, it's Puerto Penasca. And they would spend the biggest part of the winter on the beach down there. Super cheap. The girls would get out and collect seashells, and every night they would have a cocktail party with their other friends, Bob Myers and some other guys, whoever was there, and they'd all sit around, drink, and play I Can Top That. Anyway, so great guy. He's always been really interesting, entertaining, hard worker, and the only guy I ever know who says, I've never had a real job.